Today, I'm going to delve into a side of racism that is far too overlooked. That is internalized racism, specifically within Asian Americans. I came to recognize this issue from stimulus materials from Judith Binney and Rachel Gonsa. Judith Binney highlights perpetuating colonialist attitudes in our world. Her particular research is with the Maori, and in explaining the Maori's verbal history, she touches on the difference in views between the colonizers and the colonized. In this map from the Decolonial Atlas, we can see the loss of Maori land over time due to white colonization, something that countless other minorities have also faced. All minorities, like the Maori, have been subjected to this kind of white oppression for years, consequently causing suffering within these minorities in varying ways and forms. I was then led to look deeper into that suffering within the US specifically, recognizing the prominent African American racism here within Rachel Gonsa's My Mother's House. Gonsa explains how her mother suppressed her family history. Her mother, like many African Americans, have developed a sense of shame in their history and culture. This is where I specifically recognize the issue of internalized racism, where minority races come to accept racist values placed on them and becoming racist towards themselves. As demonstrated here by the graph from the Pew Research Center, it is undoubtedly true that the Black community faces the most racism in the US, with almost half of the population agreeing they face a lot of discrimination today. However, there are other minority groups that face similar issues, such as Hispanics and Asians. Taiwanese American psychologist Kenneth T. Wong et al. Explain how Asian Americans have been deemed a model minority due to their supposed success in this country. However, under this guise of equality, internalized racism has actually taken deep root within the Asian American community as well. As an Asian American myself, I was then prompted to really dive into the effects of internalized racism within this specific group. So then, to what extent has internalized racism negatively affected Asian Americans? And what does this imply about a need for change? Well, after thoroughly researching the topic, I've concluded that internalized racism has detrimental health effects on Asian American mental health and society, creating the need for measures against Asian racism. First, I want to discuss the history of Asian racism in America, for it is often overlooked when considering American history as a whole. Psychologist Stephen Sanders et al. Reveal that Asian Americans have actually been subjected to years of European colonization, systemic oppression, discrimination, and more. This hidden oppression in our history can be exemplified in the exploited Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, as well as incarcerated Japanese Americans in World War II, thousands of which were actually incinerated in internment camps right here in the US. Those are just some of the more well-known historical examples. Social science professor David H. Che and psychology professor Su Lan Teng also note the more easily seen Asian racism in recent history with the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the pandemic originated in China, Asians have received widespread hate, even being blamed for the pandemic as a whole and receiving physical attacks. Taking that into account on the history and with the recent spike in Asian hate, it is unsurprising that internalized racism has really affected the Asian American community. So the first big topic and effect I want to discuss is the toll on the mental health. Tung explains how, because internalized racism involves the deprecation of one's identity, it largely influences minority individuals' self-concept, including how they feel about their physical appearance. Psychologist Thomas La et al. Then show how this damaged self-concept can develop into more dangerous situations, finding internalized racism to be associated positively with disordered eating. And while disordered eating is a largely mental health issue, it can also quickly spiral into a physical problem as well, with severe cases ending in hospitalization. Internalized racism has also been linked to depression and suicide. To demonstrate, here is a graph from the Suicide Prevention Resource Center showing alarmingly high percentages of suicidal ideation in the Asian youth population compared to the US population as a whole. Furthermore, from the Massachusetts Center of Asian American Studies, Fan Hao Nie recently conducted a study surveying Asian Americans in 2024. She concludes that the deleterious internalized racism effect on suicidal ideation was actually stronger among US Asians, especially among US Asians who attended religious services more often. With these connections to eating disorders, depression, suicide, and more, it is clear that greater measures need to be taken for the sake of Asian American mental health. Now, internalized racism doesn't just lead to suffering within the individual, but suffering of society as a whole by creating intraracial racism as well. Sociology professor Karen D. Pike explains how negative Asian stereotypes shape what Asian Americans deem appropriate within their co-ethnic peer groups. This means that Asian Americans will deem their own culture socially inappropriate and glorify mainstream white culture instead. This then leads to Asians ridiculing their own co-ethnic peers. For instance, FOB, a term standing for fresh off the boat, is a term that Asian Americans have come to use for their peers, predominantly targeted towards Asians that have newly immigrated, those with thick accents, displaying nerdy values, among countless other Asian stereotypes. Language and identity researcher Naomi Min Win reinforces Pike's findings with her research on Asian American behavior online. One of Win's findings include a post followed by the tags #whitewashed, #whitewashedAsian, #way2go. Other derogatory terms like the aforementioned FOB have been found to be used regularly online as well. This normalization of these kinds of tags and terms only fortify negative beliefs into the memory, worsening the issue of racism as a whole in our society. So the racism ingrained in minority memories really should not shape who they are. Now we can see that internalized racism is really no light matter, and especially shouldn't be looked over when considering the Asian American community as well. Now that this issue has been seen under the facade of a model minority, it is time to make the greater changes needed. Although it might not be easy, they need to be made so that we can better our society.
Thank you. Okay, my first question is, how did your research question evolve as you moved through the research process?
Yes, my initial research question was about the effects of racism and internalized racism on the individual, but upon doing more research, I found that the effects really varied between different racial groups, which led me to eventually narrow down my question to specifically how it affected Asian Americans, because I felt there was too much information if I were to include all the races, and I felt more passionate about this specific race.
And my second question is, how did you use the conclusions or questions of others to advance your own research?
One of the first articles that I read concluded that internalized racism led to suicidal ideation. That is what really furthered and advanced my research in the mental health aspect of internalized racism and how that affected Asian Americans, because I felt that suicide was the furthest that you could go when considering that, and that really brought to my attention how serious that this issue can be in that aspect.